They buried him at sunrise, so when he rode back at dusk, no one reached for a gun. The wind carried dust across the open plain like a whisper that didn't want to be heard, and Ethan Caldwell followed that whisper without knowing why, his horse moving slow, tired from miles of dry land that stretched farther than any map had the right to claim, the kind of land where a man could disappear and never be missed, the kind of land where names didn't matter unless someone remembered them, and Ethan wasn't sure anyone did, not anymore. He had been riding for 2 days without a clear destination, just the pull of something he couldn't explain, something that sat behind his ribs like a memory that refused to take shape, and when the first shape of the camp appeared on the horizon, low tents, thin smoke curling into a pale sky, he felt it tighten, like a hand closing slowly around his chest. He should have turned back. Any man with sense would have. But sense had been slipping from him ever since the dream started. Firelight. A voice calling a name that wasn't Ethan. The smell of sage and earth after rain. None of it belonged to him, and yet it stayed. His horse slowed on its own as they reached the edge of the settlement, hooves pressing softly into the packed dirt, and Ethan noticed something strange before he even spoke a word. No one moved. There were people, dozens of them, standing between the tents, near the fire pits, by the edges of the open space, but not a single one stepped forward. Not a single hand reached for a weapon, not even a warning call broke the stillness, just eyes, watching, measuring, waiting like they had already seen this moment before and knew how it would end. Ethan raised one hand slightly, not in greeting, not in surrender, just enough to show he meant no harm, though out here that didn't mean much, and his voice came out rough from the dust when he said, "I'm just passing through," but the words didn't land the way they should have, didn't ripple through the crowd or draw suspicion, they just faded, like the air swallowed them before anyone could react. Then it happened. An old man stepped forward, slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that carried weight without needing strength. And for a second Ethan thought this would be the moment everything turned, the moment questions came, maybe even a warning to leave, but instead the old man lowered himself to his knees, head bowed, hands resting open in the dust like he was greeting something sacred or something long gone, and the silence deepened until it felt like the world itself had stopped to listen. Ethan didn't move. Couldn't. Because one by one, others followed. Not all of them. But enough. Men. Women. Even a boy no older than 10. Kneeling. Not in fear. Not exactly. Something else. Something heavier. Like recognition wrapped in disbelief. His fingers tightened slightly around the reins as he glanced from face to face, searching for anger, confusion, anything that made sense, but what he found instead was something that unsettled him more than any drawn gun ever could: grief. Quiet. Old. Still breathing beneath the surface. Then, from the edge of the group, someone didn't kneel. A woman stepped forward, her posture straight, her eyes fixed on him in a way that didn't carry the same weight as the others, her gaze sharp, cutting through whatever illusion the rest seemed to be caught in, and when she stopped a few feet away, close enough for him to see the way the light caught the edges of her face, she didn't bow her head, didn't speak, didn't offer anything but that stare, like she was looking at a man and a lie at the same time. Ethan swallowed once, slow, and said, "Quieter now, you got the wrong idea," but even as the words left him, he wasn't sure they were true. Because something in the air had shifted. Something he couldn't name but could feel settling into place, like a story he had walked into halfway through, and the worst part wasn't that he didn't understand it. The worst part was that some part of him almost did. The old man did not rise right away, and that was the first thing that felt wrong to Ethan, because out here respect usually moved both ways, but this was not respect, not the kind he knew, this was something quieter, something that did not ask for permission, and when the wind shifted it carried the scent of smoke and dry sage through the camp, stirring the edges of something buried deep in his mind, something that should not have been there, and yet it lingered, just out of reach, like a name he had almost remembered once before and then lost. The woman who had remained standing took another step closer, her boots pressing softly into the dust, and the distance between them closed in a way that made the silence feel tighter, heavier, as if the space itself was holding its breath, and Ethan noticed now that no one else dared to move while she did, no one spoke, no one even shifted their weight, they were all waiting on her, not the old man, not the elders, her. She stopped an arm's length away and studied his face with a patience that made him uneasy, not searching for threat, not searching for weakness, but something else entirely, something deeper, like she was comparing what she saw to something that only existed in memory. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, and carried no fear at all. "You took your time coming back." The words did not land as a question. They landed like a statement that had been waiting years to be said, and Ethan felt that tightening in his chest again, sharper now, more insistent, like whatever had been pulling him here had just found its answer. But he shook his head once, slow, and said, "You have the wrong man," though the certainty in his voice did not feel as strong as it should have, and that unsettled him more than anything else. The woman's eyes did not change, but something in them shifted, not doubt, not belief, something in between, and she reached into the fold of her clothing and brought out a small object, holding it in her palm where the light could catch it, and for a moment Ethan did not understand what he was looking at, just a simple piece of worn silver wrapped around a stone the color of the sky before a storm. But then his breath caught, quiet, involuntary, because there was another one exactly like it. Resting against his own chest beneath his shirt, a thing he had carried for as long as he could remember without ever knowing why, without ever knowing where it had come from. The woman tilted her hand slightly, letting the pendant sway just enough to catch his attention fully, and said, "This was buried with him," and the words pressed into the air between them like weight, like truth that refused to move, and Ethan's hand moved before he could stop it, fingers brushing against his chest, finding the edge of the hidden cord beneath his shirt, and he hesitated there for a second that felt longer than it should have, because something inside him already knew what would happen next, already understood that whatever this was, it was not coincidence. Slowly, he pulled the pendant free and let it hang in the open, the silver catching the same light, the same shape, the same stone, and for the first time since he had ridden into the camp, a sound moved through the people around him, not loud, not sudden, just a low murmur that spread like wind through tall grass, something between disbelief and recognition, something that carried memory with it, and the old man finally lifted his head, his eyes fixed on the matching pieces with a kind of quiet certainty that did not need explanation. Ethan looked from one pendant to the other, then back to the woman, and said, "Softer now, I have had this all my life," and even as he said it, he realized how little that actually meant, how little of that life he could truly account for, because the further back he tried to remember, the more it blurred into shapes and fragments that never quite settled into anything solid. The woman stepped closer again, close enough now that he could see the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the kind that came from years of holding something in without letting it show, and she reached out, not touching him yet, just hovering her hand near the pendant as if testing whether it was real, and then she said, very quietly, "Then you were never meant to lose it," and that was when the feeling in Ethan's chest shifted from unease into something else entirely, something heavier. Something that did not belong to a stranger passing through, because strangers did not carry pieces of other people's pasts without reason, and strangers were not greeted like echoes of the dead, and for the first time since he had crossed into this place, he stopped thinking about leaving, because leaving would not answer the question that had already taken root, and out here, questions like that did not fade, they waited, just like the people standing in silence around him, just like the woman who had not knelt, just like the memory he could not quite reach but could no longer ignore. The murmur did not fade quickly, it lingered in the air like dust that refused to settle, and Ethan could feel it pressing in from every direction, not loud enough to overwhelm him, but steady enough to remind him that whatever he had stepped into was no longer his to walk away from without consequence, and the woman standing in front of him did not look at the pendant anymore, she looked at him, as if the object had already done its job, as if it had opened a door that could not be closed again, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried something new beneath it, not doubt, not certainty, something closer to recognition that she did not fully trust. "Where did you come from?" she asked, and this time it was a question, but not the kind that waited patiently for an answer, it was the kind that already expected one, and Ethan hesitated because the truth was simple and useless at the same time. "North of here," he said, "ranch land. Small place, nothing worth remembering, but..." Even as he spoke the words they felt thin, like a story told too many times without ever being questioned, and the woman's gaze did not shift, did not soften, she just listened, then nodded once, slow, like she had heard something she already knew would not be enough. Behind her, the old man had risen to his feet, and when he stepped forward his presence carried a quiet authority that did not need to be announced, the kind that came from years of watching things unfold exactly as they were meant to, and he stopped beside the woman, his eyes moving between her and Ethan before settling on the pendant once more. Then he spoke, his voice rough with age but steady. "Names matter here." And he paused just long enough for the words to settle. "What name do you carry?" And Ethan opened his mouth to answer quickly, instinctively, the way a man does when he has nothing to hide, but the word caught in his throat for a fraction of a second longer than it should have, just long enough to make him aware of it, just long enough to make it feel like something was off. "Ethan," he said finally, "Ethan Caldwell," and the name sounded right when he said it, but it did not land the way he expected. It did not hold the ground the way a name should. It just existed, like something borrowed. The old man studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the woman, and whatever passed between them did not need words. It moved in the silence, in the way her shoulders shifted slightly, in the way his expression settled into something that looked less like surprise and more like confirmation. And then the woman turned back to Ethan and said, "That is not the name we buried," and the sentence was simple, but it carried weight that pressed into Ethan's chest harder than anything before it. Because buried meant final, buried meant something had ended, and yet here he stood, breathing the same air, wearing the same face. A flicker of something moved through his mind then, quick, sharp, gone before he could hold on to it, a shape of a memory that did not belong to the life he remembered, and he reached for it instinctively, like a man trying to catch something falling through his hands, but it slipped away, leaving only the feeling behind, the echo of something unfinished. The woman took a step back this time, creating space instead of closing it, and she gestured slightly toward the center of the camp where a narrow path led between the tents. "Come," she said, and there was no force in it, no command, just an invitation that felt heavier than an order ever could, and Ethan hesitated again, not because he was afraid, but because he understood now that every step he took forward would take him further away from the version of himself he thought he knew, and closer to something else entirely, something that had been waiting long before he arrived. He glanced once over his shoulder, back toward the open land he had come from, the wide stretch of nothing that had always felt like freedom, and for a brief moment he considered turning back, riding until the questions faded and the road swallowed him again, but the thought did not hold. It slipped away just as quickly as the memory had, because something here had already taken root, something that would follow him no matter how far he went, and slowly, without another word, he stepped forward, falling into pace beside the woman as she led him deeper into the camp, past the watching eyes, past the kneeling figures who had not yet risen, past the quiet that seemed to grow thicker with each step, and somewhere in that silence, beneath the sound of his own boots against the earth, he began to understand that whatever name he carried, whatever story he believed was his, it was no longer the only one that mattered. They walked in silence, and the deeper Ethan followed her into the camp, the more the world behind him seemed to fade, not all at once, but in small pieces, like something being gently taken apart, the open land, the long road, the version of himself that belonged to it, all of it slipping further away with each step, and in its place came details he could not explain why he noticed, the way the wind shifted differently between the tents, the faint pattern carved into a wooden post near a fire pit, the smell of dried herbs hanging from a line, each one brushing against something in his mind that felt familiar in a way that did not belong to memory, and that was what unsettled him most, not that he did not recognize these things, but that some part of him did. The woman did not look back to see if he was following, she already knew he would, and when they reached the center of the camp she stopped beside a low structure made of wood and earth, its surface worn smooth by time and weather, and for a moment she did not speak, she just stood there, letting the quiet settle around them, letting whatever needed to rise on its own. Ethan's gaze moved across the ground, and that was when he saw it, the markings, faint but deliberate, carved into the wood at the base of the structure, lines and shapes that formed something more than decoration, something closer to a story told without words, and his chest tightened again, sharper now, because he did not understand it, but he felt it, the way a man feels the edge of a memory just before it comes into focus. The woman finally spoke, her voice lower than before, almost careful. "This is where we brought him," and she did not need to explain who she meant, the weight of the words made it clear enough, and Ethan stepped closer without being asked, his boots pressing into the dirt with a quiet sound that seemed louder than it should have been, like the ground itself was listening. He crouched slightly, studying the markings, tracing them with his eyes, and something flickered again, quicker this time, a flash of light, the sound of voices he could not fully hear, and he pulled in a slow breath as if that might steady whatever was shifting inside him, but it did not. It only made it clearer that something was changing, something he could not stop. He was not alone, the woman continued, and Ethan looked up at her, catching the way her gaze had softened just slightly, not with kindness, but with something deeper, something that came from carrying a truth for too long. There were others that night, she said, people who did not belong to this land, people who spoke a different way, who wore different clothes, who did not understand what they were taking, and the words settled between them like pieces of a puzzle that had not yet been arranged, and Ethan felt that pull again, stronger now, like whatever had brought him here was beginning to show its shape. He shook his head once, instinctively. I do not remember any of that, he said, and this time the words felt more like a confession than a denial, and the woman nodded, not surprised, not disappointed, just accepting. Memory does not always stay where it belongs, she said quietly, and then she reached out, not to him, but to the ground beside the structure, brushing her fingers lightly across the surface as if acknowledging something that could not be seen, and then she stood again and met his eyes. But truth does. The old man had followed at a distance, and now he stepped closer, his presence filling the space without force, and he spoke with the same calm certainty as before. We marked this place so we would not forget, he said, and Ethan felt the weight of that statement settle into him, because forgetting had always been easy for him, too easy, pieces of his past slipping through without resistance, things that should have mattered fading without reason, and standing here now, in front of something that had been remembered so deliberately, he began to understand that forgetting was not always an accident. The woman turned slightly, gesturing beyond the structure, toward a narrow path that led further out, away from the center of the camp, toward a quieter edge where fewer people stood, and fewer eyes watched. There is something else you need to see, she said, and her voice carried a different weight now, not just recognition, not just memory, but something closer to revelation, something that could not be taken back once it was understood. And Ethan hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward again, because whatever this was, whatever had been waiting here all this time, it was no longer something he could choose to ignore, and as he followed her once more, he realized that the question had changed. It was no longer about whether he belonged here, it was about whether he had ever truly belonged anywhere else at all. The path narrowed as they moved away from the center of the camp, the ground beneath Ethan's boots turning softer, less traveled, as if fewer people chose to walk this way unless they had reason to, and the sounds behind them faded into something distant, muted by space and intention, leaving only the quiet rhythm of their steps and the low whisper of wind moving through dry grass. And Ethan felt it again, that pull, stronger now, not just a feeling in his chest but something deeper, something that seemed to guide his eyes before his thoughts could catch up, and when the woman slowed, he knew they had arrived before he even saw it. It was not large, not marked in a way that demanded attention, just a stretch of earth slightly raised, shaped by careful hands rather than time, and beside it stood a simple wooden post, weathered and worn, the grain of it cracked from years beneath the sun, and Ethan stopped without needing to be told, his gaze settling on the shape of the ground, then lifting slowly to the post, where faint carvings remained, barely visible unless you were close enough to care, and something inside him shifted, not sharply this time, not like the flashes before, but slower, heavier, like a door opening just enough to let something through. The woman did not speak right away. She let the silence sit between them, let him look, let him feel whatever it was that had drawn him here, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, but no less steady. This is where we laid him to rest, she said, and the word settled into the air like something final, something that had not changed in all the years since it was first spoken, and Ethan took a step closer, his eyes tracing the edges of the mound, the shape of it, the way the earth had settled over time, and he did not know why his breath slowed, why his chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear, but it did, and he could not ignore it. What was his name? He asked quietly, and this time the question felt different, not casual, not distant, but necessary, like a piece of something he needed in order to understand the rest, and the woman looked at him for a long moment before answering, as if measuring whether he was ready to hear it, and then she said, Thomas, and the name hung there, simple, unadorned, but heavy with meaning, and Ethan felt it land somewhere deep, somewhere he had not known existed until now, and for a brief second the world around him seemed to blur, not fully, just enough to make the edges soften, and he saw something else layered beneath it, something that did not belong to the present, a figure standing where he stood now, the same sky above, the same wind moving through the same grass, and then it was gone, leaving only the echo behind. He took another slow breath and reached out, not fully thinking about it, his hand hovering just above the surface of the ground before settling lightly against it, and the contact was simple, nothing more than skin against earth, but it carried a weight that surprised him, like touching something that held more than it showed, and he closed his eyes for a brief moment, not out of intention, but because something in him needed to, and in that moment the silence deepened, the world narrowing to that single point of contact, and he felt it again, not a memory exactly, not something clear, but something familiar, something that belonged and did not belong at the same time. "We did not find his body the way it should have been," the woman said quietly, and Ethan opened his eyes, looking up at her, and there was no accusation in her tone, no anger, just truth, steady and unyielding. "There were things that did not make sense," she continued, "things that we could not explain, but we honored him the only way we could," and she gestured slightly toward the ground, toward the place where the earth had been shaped with care, and Ethan looked back at it, his hand still resting there, and the weight of her words settled deeper, because honoring someone meant believing they were gone, meant accepting that whatever questions remained would stay unanswered, and yet here he stood, a question that refused to stay buried. The old man stepped closer then, his presence quiet but firm, and he looked down at the ground, then at Ethan, and said, "We do not mistake faces lightly," and there was no challenge in the words, no demand, just a statement of fact, and Ethan felt it press into him, because he had always trusted his own reflection, had always known who he was when he looked in a mirror, but now that certainty felt thinner, less solid, like something that had never been tested until this moment. The woman moved slightly, positioning herself so that she stood between him and the path they had come from, not blocking it, but reminding him of it, reminding him that there was still a choice to be made, and she said, "If you walk away now, nothing here will follow you," and her voice was calm, offering, not forcing, "But if you stay, you will not leave the same," and Ethan held her gaze for a long moment, then looked back down at the ground, at the place where a name had been laid to rest. And he understood then that this was not about what he remembered, or what he believed, it was about what he was willing to face, and slowly, without lifting his hand from the earth, he said, "Then I stay," because leaving had already stopped being an option the moment he stepped into a story that had been waiting for him long before he knew it existed. The word stayed in the air longer than it should have, not loud, not dramatic, just present, like something that had been waiting years to be spoken and finally found its place, and Ethan felt it settle into him in a way he could not explain, not as a decision, but as something closer to recognition, as if the choice had already been made long before he understood it, and the woman watched him carefully, not surprised, not relieved, just aware, like she had seen this moment before in a different form, and when he finally lifted his hand from the earth, the absence of contact felt heavier than the touch itself, like letting go of something that had quietly taken hold. The wind moved again, slower now, carrying with it the faint sound of voices from the camp behind them, distant, cautious, and Ethan realized that word would travel, that whatever he had just said, whatever he had just accepted, it would not remain between the three of them for long, and the weight of that settled in next, because staying did not mean standing still, it meant stepping into something that would ask more of him than he had ever planned to give. The old man nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, but it carried the kind of finality that did not need to be repeated, and then he turned slightly, looking back toward the camp as if measuring the space between what had been and what was about to begin, and he said quietly, "Then you will need to understand what you are staying for," and the words were not a warning, not a threat, just a truth offered without decoration. And Ethan met his gaze without looking away, because something in him had already shifted past hesitation. The woman stepped forward then, moving past him this time, guiding the direction instead of leading it, and Ethan turned to follow without needing to be asked, and as they walked back along the narrow path, the camp came into view again, but it did not look the same, not exactly, because now he saw the space differently, saw the way people stood in small groups, the way their attention turned toward him and then away again, like they were trying to decide what he was without saying it out loud. And the quiet that had greeted him before had changed, not broken, but altered, carrying something beneath it now, something closer to tension, not sharp, but present. A man stood near the edge of the open space, arms folded across his chest, his posture steady, his gaze fixed on Ethan in a way that did not carry the same weight as the others. This was not grief, not reverence, this was something else, something that questioned, that measured, and when Ethan's eyes met his, the man did not look away. He just held the stare for a moment longer than necessary before turning slightly toward the woman, and she stopped, just for a second, as if acknowledging that This part could not be avoided. He does not belong, the man said, his voice calm but firm, not raised, not aggressive, just certain, and the words did not echo, they settled, like stones placed carefully where they could not be ignored, and Ethan felt them land, not as an insult, but as a challenge that had been waiting for him since the moment he arrived. The woman did not respond immediately, she let the silence sit, let the weight of the statement exist without rushing to fill it, and then she said, "He is here," and there was something in the way she said it that carried more meaning than the words themselves, something that suggested presence mattered more than origin, but the man shook his head slightly, not in anger, just in refusal. "Being here is not the same as belonging," he said, and his gaze shifted back to Ethan, steady, unblinking. "Spirits do not breathe, and strangers do not carry our dead," and the sentence hung there, balanced between belief and doubt, and Ethan understood then that this was not something that would resolve itself quietly, not something that would fade if he stood still long enough. This was something that would ask him to stand, to answer, to prove something he did not yet understand himself. He took a slow breath, feeling the air settle in his chest, grounding him in a way that the questions could not shake, and he stepped forward just slightly, enough to close the distance without turning it into a confrontation, and he said, evenly, "Then I am neither," and the words came out without force, without challenge, just truth as he knew it, and for a moment the man's expression shifted, not enough to show agreement, but enough to acknowledge that the answer had not been what he expected. The old man stepped between them then, not to block, not to interrupt, just to redirect, his presence steady as ever, and he said, "Truth does not rush," and the simplicity of it cut through the tension without breaking it, just easing it into something that could be held instead of resisted, and the man gave a small nod, stepping back without another word, but the look he left behind did not disappear, it lingered, a reminder that whatever Ethan was stepping into would not accept him without question. The woman glanced at Ethan briefly, just long enough to measure something in his expression, and then she turned again, continuing toward the center of the camp, and this time when Ethan followed, he understood that staying was not the end of the question, it was only the beginning, and somewhere beneath the weight of everything he did not know, something steadier had begun to form, something that did not come from memory, but from choice, and out here, choice was the only thing a man could truly call his own. The camp did not return to what it had been before he arrived, it shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the air before a storm that never quite breaks, and Ethan could feel it in the way conversation stopped when he passed, in the way eyes followed him just a second longer than they should, not openly hostile, not welcoming either, something in between, something that held judgment without speaking it aloud, and he understood then that silence could weigh more than words ever could. The woman walked ahead of him without slowing, her pace steady, her path deliberate, and when they reached the fire at the center, she stopped and turned, facing not just him now, but the others who had begun to gather at a distance, drawn by something they did not yet understand but could not ignore, and the old man remained nearby, watching, not intervening, not directing, just present in a way that made everything feel anchored. "He stays," the woman said, and the statement did not rise, did not demand, it simply existed, placed into the space like a marker that could not be moved without consequence, and a few of the people shifted at that, not in protest, but in acknowledgement that something had just changed, something that would not be undone easily. Ethan stood where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, because he understood that this was not his place to claim, not yet, and that whatever came next would not be decided by him alone. The man who had spoken before remained at the edge, arms still folded, his posture unchanged, but his gaze sharper now, more focused, and after a moment he stepped closer, not aggressively, not rushing, just enough to enter the space where his presence could not be ignored, and he said, "Then he proves it," and there was no anger in it, just a certainty that felt older than the moment itself, and the words did not feel like a demand. They felt like a rule that had always been there, waiting to be followed. The woman did not turn away from Ethan when she answered, her eyes still on him, as if whatever was being decided would pass through him before it reached anyone else. "He will," she said, and there was something in her voice that carried both trust and caution, not blind, not fragile, just steady, and Ethan felt it land, felt the expectation settle alongside everything else, heavier now, more defined. The old man stepped forward slightly then, his presence filling the space between them all, and he looked at Ethan for a long moment before speaking. "A name is not given twice without reason," he said, and the words moved slowly, deliberately, like they had been spoken many times before in different ways. If you carry it, you must understand it, and Ethan held his gaze, not looking away, because something in him had already begun to accept that understanding would not come easily, would not come all at once. It would have to be earned, piece by piece, through things he could not yet see. The woman reached into her clothing again, but this time she did not bring out the pendant. She brought out something smaller, something worn smooth from time and use, a thin strip of leather tied into a simple loop, and she held it out toward Ethan without stepping closer, leaving the space between them for him to cross if he chose to, and for a moment he did not move, because he understood that this was not just an object, not just something to take without thought. This was something that would bind him to whatever came next, something that would mark the point where turning back stopped being simple. The wind shifted again, brushing against his face, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth, and something in it felt familiar in a way that no longer startled him. It simply existed, like it had always been there waiting for him to notice, and slowly, without breaking eye contact, he stepped forward, closing the distance, and reached out, his hand steady as he took the leather loop from hers, and the moment his fingers closed around it, the space around them seemed to settle, not quieting, not changing completely, but aligning, as if something that had been out of place had just been set where it belonged. The man at the edge watched this without speaking, his expression unreadable, but his stance shifted slightly, not acceptance, not refusal, something closer to acknowledgement, and the others remained where they were, watching, waiting, as if they understood that whatever this was, it was not finished yet, not even close. Ethan looked down at the leather in his hand, then back at the woman, and for the first time since he had arrived, the question in his eyes was not about where he was, or why he was here, it was about what came next, and she saw it, understood it, and gave the smallest nod, not reassurance, not instruction, just a recognition that he had reached the point where answers would no longer be given, they would have to be found, and out here, that was the only way they ever truly mattered. The leather felt lighter than it should have in Ethan's hand, but the meaning of it did not. It settled into him with a quiet weight that did not need explanation, and as he closed his fingers around it, something inside him shifted again, not sudden this time, not sharp, but steady, like a line finely drawn where there had only been uncertainty before, and the camp seemed to breathe with it, not all at once, not in a way that anyone could point to, but in the small ways that mattered, the way shoulders eased just slightly, the way the silence changed from tension into something closer to watchfulness, and Ethan understood that he had crossed something invisible, something that could not be undone by simply walking away. The woman stepped back then, giving him space again, but her eyes did not leave him, and there was something different in them now, not acceptance, not yet, but a recognition that had deepened, like she was no longer looking at a stranger standing in the wrong place, but at someone who had stepped into a role that was still being shaped. "You will need to see what we saw," she said quietly, and the words carried a weight that felt older than the moment, and Ethan nodded once without thinking, because whatever this was, whatever had begun here, it was not something he could understand by standing still. The old man moved first this time, turning away from the fire and walking toward the far side of the camp where the land began to slope downward, and the others did not follow. They stayed where they were, watching, waiting, as if this part was not meant for everyone to witness, and Ethan fell into step behind the woman as she followed the old man, the leather loop still resting in his hand, his grip steady now, no longer uncertain. The ground changed as they walked, the packed dirt giving way to softer earth, scattered with stones and dry grass, and the wind moved differently here, carrying less of the camp and more of the open land beyond, and Ethan felt something in it that stirred again, not a memory, not fully, but a familiarity that no longer felt distant. It felt closer now, like something just beneath the surface waiting to rise. The old man stopped near the edge of a shallow rise, where the land dipped just enough to reveal a stretch of earth that had been disturbed long ago and then left to settle on its own, and he gestured toward it with a small motion of his hand. "This is where we found him," he said, and Ethan stepped closer, his gaze moving across the ground, searching for something he could not yet name, and at first it looked like nothing more than earth shaped by time. But then he noticed the pattern, the way the soil had settled unevenly, the faint traces of something that had once been there and then taken away. There was no struggle, the old man continued, his voice calm, steady, no sign of conflict, only absence, and the word lingered, heavier than it should have been, because absence meant something had been removed, not lost, not misplaced, but but taken in a way that left nothing behind except questions, and Ethan felt that word settle deeper than the others, because it fit too well with what he had been feeling, with the gaps in his own memory, the spaces where things should have been and were not. The woman stepped beside him, her gaze fixed on the same stretch of earth, and she said quietly, "We searched for answers, but none came," and there was no frustration in her tone, no bitterness, just truth accepted over time, and Ethan lowered his gaze again, studying the ground more closely, and that was when it happened, not a flash this time, not a flicker, but something slower, something that unfolded instead of striking, and for a moment the present shifted just enough for something else to rise beneath it, the same land, the same sky, but different, filled with movement that he could not fully see, voices carried on the wind that he could not fully hear, and at the center of it, a presence, not clear, not defined, but familiar in a way that made his breath catch. He straightened slightly, his hand tightening around the leather loop, and he said, almost to himself, "This place," and the words did not finish, because he did not know how to finish them, but the woman heard enough, and she turned her head slightly, studying him with a quiet intensity that had not faded since the beginning. "You feel it," she said, and it was not a question, and Ethan did not deny it this time, he just nodded once, slow, because whatever this was, it was no longer something he could push aside or explain away. The old man watched him for a long moment, then said, "Truth leaves marks, even when it is hidden," and Ethan let the word settle, because he could feel it now, not clearly, not fully, but enough to know that something had happened here that had not ended the way it should have, something that had been covered, not forgotten, and as he stood there, looking down at the place where answers should have been and were not, he realized that the question had changed again. It was no longer about who he was, or where he came from. It was about what had been taken, and why he was the one standing in its place, and somewhere deep beneath everything else, something quiet began to form, not a memory, not yet, but something closer to truth finding its way back to the surface, one piece at a time. The wind did not change, but something inside Ethan did, and as he stood there looking down at the quiet stretch of earth, he realized that the absence the old man had spoken of was not empty at all, it was full of something waiting, something patient, something that had not been able to speak until now, and the weight of it settled into him with a clarity that did not come from memory, but from understanding. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like something he had been holding for years without knowing it, and when he looked up, the land did not feel foreign anymore, it felt familiar, not in the way of recognition, but in the way of belonging that had been delayed, misplaced, but never entirely lost. The woman stood beside him, her presence steady, her gaze still searching his face for something she had not yet named, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter than it had ever been. "You see it now," and Ethan did not answer right away, because what he saw was not something that could be explained in words, it was not a clear picture, not a single truth, it was pieces, fragments that did not fully connect but no longer felt separate. And after a moment he nodded, just once, because that was enough. The old man watched him closely, and there was no surprise in his eyes, no triumph, just a calm acceptance, like he had been waiting for this exact moment and nothing about it had unfolded differently than it should have, and he said, "Then you understand why we could not let it remain buried," and the words did not feel like a demand, they felt like an opening, a door that had been held closed until someone could step through it without turning away. Ethan looked back down at the ground one more time, then slowly straightened, his hand still holding the leather loop, and without thinking, he tied it around his wrist, the motion simple, deliberate, and when he tightened it into place, it felt less like something new and more like something returned, something that had been missing without him ever knowing it. The woman saw it and did not speak, but something in her expression shifted, not relief, not certainty, but something closer to peace, quiet and restrained, like a storm that had finally passed without leaving damage behind. They stood there for a moment longer, the three of them, with the land stretching out around them, silent, patient, and then Ethan turned, not back toward the camp, not yet, but toward the horizon beyond it, the wide open space that had once been his only direction, and he studied it for a long moment, the distance, the emptiness, the freedom it had once represented, and he realized that it no longer held the same meaning it once had. Not because it had changed, but because he had. The road was still there, waiting, just as it always had been, but now it felt smaller, less certain, like something that belonged to a version of himself that no longer fit the shape he had become. The woman stepped back slightly, giving him space without stepping away entirely, and she said, softly, "You can still go," and there was no pressure in it, no expectation, just truth offered plainly, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging it, because he understood that choice had not been taken from him, it had only been clarified. He looked back toward the camp then, toward the people who still watched from a distance, toward the fire that burned low but steady, toward the place that had greeted him not with questions, but with something deeper, something harder to face, and he took a single step in that direction, not fast, not hesitant, just steady, and that step said more than any words he could have chosen. The old man gave the slightest nod, almost too small to notice, and turned back toward the camp without another word, and the woman followed after a moment, her pace slow enough to remain beside Ethan without guiding him, without leading him, just walking with him, and as they moved, the distance between him and the others began to close, not quickly, not all at once, but gradually, like something being rebuilt piece by piece. No one spoke when he returned, no one asked him to explain what he had seen, what he had felt, because they did not need to. They could see it in the way he walked, in the way he carried himself, in the way he no longer looked like a man passing through, but like someone who had chosen to stay. The man at the edge watched him again, his expression still guarded, but something in it had softened, just slightly, enough to acknowledge that whatever question had been asked was no longer unanswered, and Ethan met his gaze briefly, not as a challenge, not as a defense, just as something steady, something that did not need to prove itself anymore. The fire crackled softly as he stepped closer, the sound grounding, familiar in a way that no longer felt borrowed, and he stopped there, not claiming a place, not seeking one, just standing where he was, and for the first time since he had arrived, the silence around him did not feel heavy, it felt bright. And out there, beyond the edge of the camp, the wind moved across the land just as it always had, carrying stories no one could fully hear, but for the first time, Ethan understood that some stories did not need to be remembered to be true, they only needed someone willing to stand still long enough to let them return.